In the middle of the Nevada desert, fenced off behind a locked gate and a security camera, there is a hole in the ground that drops straight into darkness. Divers have gone down more than 400 feet inside it and still never found the bottom. The water sits at a constant 93 degrees, has for as long as anyone has measured it, and inside that water lives a fish that exists nowhere else on Earth. Not in another cave, not in another state, not anywhere. Its entire world is one sunlit shelf of rock roughly the size of a small bedroom. In 2013, biologists counted every one of them they could find. The number was 35. 35 fish, the entire global population of a vertebrate species, small enough to fit inside a home aquarium. And against nearly every prediction made about them since, they are still here. This is the story of how they have stayed that way. The hole is called Devil's Hole, and it sits in a stretch of the Amargosa Desert, so remote that the nearest town barely qualifies as one. Technically, it belongs to Death Valley National Park, even though it is separated from the rest of the park by more than 20 miles of open desert, a detached island of federal land wrapped around a puddle. At the surface, it looks unimpressive. The opening is barely 10 feet across, a crack in the limestone that most people would walk past without a second look. What lies beneath it is the opposite of unimpressive. The pool is the visible mouth of a flooded cave system that nobody has ever fully mapped. Cave divers using scuba gear have descended as deep as 436 feet through narrow, twisting passages, past a submerged chamber nicknamed Brown's Room, tall enough to swallow a 5-story building, and they have still never touched a floor. Some researchers estimate the true depth could pass 500 feet, maybe more. Nobody knows for certain, because nobody has come back up with an answer. In 1965, a group of teenagers climbed the fence after dark to go diving in the hole for fun. Two of them, 19-year-old Paul Giacontieri and a friend named David Rose, went down into the water and never came back up. A search team spent days combing the pool for them, diving as deep as they dared. Their bodies were never recovered. In all likelihood, they are still down there, somewhere in the 400 feet of water that has never given up its floor to anyone. Devil's Hole is watched far more closely today than it was then. Motion sensors, an electrified perimeter fence, and cameras feeding a live monitoring system now guard a pool almost nobody is ever allowed anywhere near. That is the part of Devil's Hole most people hear about first, if they hear about it at all. It is also almost completely irrelevant to the fish. Because for all the vertical mystery below, the entire population of Devil's Hole pupfish does not live in the depths at all. It lives on a single shallow ledge near the surface, a shelf of algae-covered limestone measuring roughly 11 feet by 16 feet, lit by a narrow shaft of direct sunlight that only touches the water for a few hours a day. That shelf is the only place on the planet where this species spawns, feeds, and survives. Everywhere else in that 400-foot abyss is, to this fish, functionally empty. An entire vertebrate species, confined to a patch of rock you could stand on with room to spare. Stand at the fence today, and the desert around it looks like it could swallow the story whole. Cracked earth, scattered creosote bushes, heat that shimmers visibly off the rock by mid-morning. Look down into the opening itself, though, and the air changes. It is warmer there, faintly humid, carrying the mineral smell of water that has sat trapped underground for longer than anyone can measure. If the light hits right, you can just make out a faint shimmer on the shelf below the surface. Dozens of small fish, holding their position against a current that never really stops. The fish itself is almost absurdly small for the amount of legal and scientific effort spent protecting it. A fully grown Devil's Hole pupfish rarely reaches even an inch in length. Breeding males turn a startling, near-electric shade of blue, while females and juveniles stay a duller olive brown, easier to lose against the algae they feed on. They live fast and die young by fish standards, most surviving somewhere between 6 months and a little over a year in the wild. And because the population has spent so much of its recorded history hovering in the dozens, biologists have never been able to study them the way scientists usually study fish. They are not netted, tagged, or pulled out of the water for a closer look, not casually. When your entire species might number under 50 individuals, injuring or losing even 2 or 3 of them while counting them is not a rounding error. It is a measurable dent in the survival of the species. So for more than 50 years, every single count has been done the same slow, careful way. By eye, underwater, one fish at a time, without ever touching a single one. It remains one of the only wild vertebrate populations on the planet whose entire census is conducted purely by eyesight. The water itself should be uninhabitable by ordinary standards. It holds at a near constant 93 degrees year-round, warm enough that most freshwater fish would struggle to survive in it for long, and it carries far less dissolved oxygen than a typical lake or stream would. Cyprinodon diabolus, the devil's hole pupfish, has been isolated in that water for somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 years, ever since the vast Ice Age lakes that once covered this part of Nevada dried into desert and left this one flooded crack behind. Cut off from every other population of its kind, it kept adapting to a home that, by almost every reasonable measure, should not have been able to support life at all. Devil's hole pupfish belong to a genus found scattered across some of the harshest desert waters in North America, remnants of a chain of vast Ice Age lakes that once linked this entire region together before the climate dried the desert into what it is today. As those lakes disappeared, isolated pockets of water, springs, seeps, and flooded caves like this one kept small, separate pupfish populations alive, each one stranded in its own pocket and left to adapt to whatever temperature and chemistry that pocket happened to have. Devil's hole pupfish adapted to the single most extreme pocket of them all. Unlike most freshwater ecosystems, which spread survival risk across dozens of interconnected species, the entire food web supporting devil's hole pupfish amounts to little more than the algae growing on that one shelf and a handful of small invertebrates living alongside it. There is no redundancy built into the system. Damage the algae, and there is no backup food source waiting to take its place. Scientists took notice early. In 1952, President Truman signed a proclamation folding Devil's Hole into Death Valley National Monument, not because of the fish specifically, but because the pool itself was judged, in the language of the law, an object of scientific interest. 15 years later, in 1967, the Devil's Hole pupfish became one of the very first species in the United States to receive federal endangered species protection, years before the modern Endangered Species Act even existed. On paper, it was safe. In practice, the fight to keep it that way had barely started. The first real threat did not come from poachers, or pollution, or a changing climate. It came from a well. In 1968, a family named Kapperhert began pumping groundwater from a set of wells on their cattle ranch, roughly 2.5 miles from Devil's Hole. Their operation was substantial. A ranch worth more than $7 million, more than 80 employees on the payroll, close to 2,000 head of cattle grazing on alfalfa and Bermuda grass, irrigated by that same groundwater. What the Kapperherts did not fully reckon with, at least not at first, was that their wells and Devil's Hole drew from the exact same underground aquifer. Pump enough water out of one end of a connected system, and the water level drops at the other. It did. Season after season of pumping lowered the water table, and the surface of the pool in Devil's Hole began to fall with it. That drop mattered far more than it might sound like it should. The shallow shelf where the pupfish spawn sits only inches below the historic waterline. Lower the pool by even a small amount, and the shelf that the entire species depended on for food and reproduction would simply be left exposed to open air. Take away the shelf, and there was nowhere else in the whole range of this fish for it to go. Not a smaller territory. No territory at all. The National Park Service filed a formal protest, asking the Nevada state engineer to deny the Kapperherts' pumping permits, or at least delay a decision until the effects could be properly studied. The state engineer granted the permits anyway. Only then did the fight move into federal court, where the United States government sued a private ranch over a fish most Americans had never heard of. A district court ruled that the water level in Devil's Hole could not be allowed to drop below a fixed marker, a line carved 3 feet down the rock face, and issued a permanent injunction limiting how much the Kapperherts could pump. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the ruling. The Kapperherts appealed once more, all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. On June 7, 1976, the court ruled, unanimously, against them. The decision, Kapperhert versus United States, established a legal principle that had never been tested before in this way: that when the federal government sets aside land for a specific purpose, it implicitly reserves whatever water is necessary to fulfill that purpose, even water drawn from underground, and even water that crosses onto someone else's property to get there. Law students still study it today as one of the foundational rulings on federal reserved water rights in the United States. A $7 million cattle operation had lost a water fight to a shelf of rock the size of a bedroom, and the ruling would go on to outlive the ranch, the lawsuit, and most of the people who had argued it on both sides. That legacy matters more today than it did in 1976. The entire American Southwest is grappling with a shrinking water supply. The Colorado River system stretched thinner every year by a growing population and a warming climate. Nevada, without a major natural river system of its own to fall back on, depends more heavily on groundwater than almost any other state in the region. Nearly every new water rights dispute in that fight still runs, in some form, through a precedent that traces back to a fish smaller than a human thumb. The wind did not end the threat, it just changed its shape. Not long after the ruling, the Capoterts sold their water rights and their land to a Las Vegas development company with far bigger plans than cattle. Blueprints surfaced for a subdivision of 25,000 lots spread across more than 12,000 acres of the valley, complete with an airport, hotels, and shopping centers, all built on top of the same aquifer that fed Devil's Hole. If it had gone forward as designed, it would very likely have finished what the ranch's wells had started years earlier. The Nature Conservancy did not mince words about the stakes, warning at the time that a fully built subdivision would all but guarantee extinction for the valley's endangered fish, plants, and invertebrates. The Nature Conservancy moved before the bulldozers could. The organization purchased more than 12,000 acres of the threatened land outright and transferred it to the federal government. In 1984, that land became Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, a protected buffer wrapped around the aquifer Devil's Hole depends on. The refuge turned out to protect far more than just one fish. Ash Meadows sits on top of the same desert aquifer system, and its scattered springs and seeps support one of the densest concentrations of endemic species found anywhere in North America. Plants and animals that exist nowhere else on the continent, several of them other pupfish species found in no other spring but the one they are named after. Saving Devil's Hole meant saving the water table underneath an entire ecosystem that had been quietly evolving in isolation right alongside it. The fish had now survived a rancher, a case that reached the highest court in the country, and a real estate developer, all without ever knowing any of it had happened. None of that would matter, though, if the population inside the pool kept shrinking anyway. And it did. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, biologists diving into Devil's Hole twice a year, a count that began in April of 1972 and has not been skipped once since, still routinely found somewhere between 200 and 250 fish living on the shelf. It was a small number for a species, but a stable one. Then, sometime in the 1990s, without any single dramatic cause that scientists could ever fully agree on, the numbers started sliding. Spring counts crept downward. Fall counts followed the same direction. Year after year, the trend line only ever pointed one way, and nobody could say for certain why. By the spring of 2013, the decline had a final number attached to it. Biologists suited up, descended into the 93-degree water, and counted every fish they could find on the shelf and in the shallows around it. When they surfaced, the count was 35. Not 35% of some larger population. 35 individual fish, total, the entire population of an entire species, on the entire planet. It was the lowest number recorded since counting began in 1972, and it made the Devil's Hole pupfish, by a wide margin, one of the rarest vertebrate animals alive on Earth. It is worth pausing on how quietly a number that dramatic can arrive. There was no single collapse, no one bad season anyone could point to and say, this is when it happened. The slide from roughly 200 fish to 35 took the better part of 2 decades, one slightly lower count after another, each individual drop small enough on its own to write off as normal variation, until one spring the running total added up to something nobody could talk themselves out of anymore. 35 is a brutal number for more reasons than the obvious one. In any wild population, not every individual counted is an adult capable of breeding, and among those that are, not every pairing produces viable offspring. Biologists have a term for the smaller number that actually determines a species' genetic survival: effective population size. For Devil's Hole pupfish at their lowest point, the real, breeding-relevant number was almost certainly smaller than 35, well within the range geneticists associate with a rapid, self-reinforcing slide toward extinction, sometimes called an extinction vortex, where small numbers cause inbreeding, inbreeding produces weaker offspring, and weaker offspring produce even smaller numbers the following generation. Losing the fish inside Devil's Hole would mean losing the species outright. There was no second pool, no backup wetland, no other place on the planet where this animal existed. So in 2013, in direct response to that number, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Nevada Department of Wildlife built one anyway. Roughly 4 miles from the real Devil's Hole on the Ash Meadows Refuge, crews constructed a facility that had never existed for this species before. A 100,000-gallon tank engineered to replicate, as closely as physically possible, the exact conditions of the wild pool. The same water temperature, the same low oxygen levels, the same rough dimensions and lighting pattern as the shallow shelf where the real fish spawn. Beyond the main tank, the facility also runs a full propagation room, rows of smaller aquaria, and a wet laboratory where eggs are hatched and juveniles are raised before they are ever introduced to the larger replica shelf. It cost $4.5 million to build, funded through a public land management grant, and it exists for a single purpose: to hold a captive population of Devil's Hole pupfish that stays as genetically close as possible to the wild fish. Insurance against the day the wild population might not come back from a crash at all. Every month, staff travel out to the actual Devil's Hole and carefully collect fertilized eggs off the shelf by hand, a few at a time, then transport them back to the facility to hatch and grow up inside a controlled aquarium system before eventually being introduced into the larger tank. It is slow, careful, almost entirely unglamorous work, done far from any camera, in service of a species that most people will never see and most people will never hear of. For years, the facility's entire measurable output was a handful of surviving juvenile fish and a tank that, very gradually, began to hold a population of its own. Back in the wild pool, meanwhile, something strange was happening, and it had nothing to do with any of that careful human effort at all. In September of 2022, an earthquake struck more than 2,000 miles away, off the coast of Mexico. The shaking never reached Nevada. But water does not need the ground beneath it to move locally to feel a distant earthquake. It only needs to be connected to the same restless planet. Waves nearly 4 feet tall rolled through Devil's Hole, sloshing the pool like water in a bathtub, stripping sediment and algae straight off the shallow shelf. By every reasonable instinct, that should have been bad news for a fish that depends on that shelf to eat. Instead, biologists watched something they had never fully explained before. Jennifer Gum, who manages the refuge tank facility for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, would later call it one of the strangest and most fascinating quirks of this species' behavior. The disturbance itself seemed to trigger a wave of spawning. Fish paired off. Eggs appeared across the shelf. That fall, the count came back at 263, the highest number recorded in 19 years. Nobody had engineered that. Nobody had planned it. A random geological event on the other side of a continent had, entirely by accident, done more for the population in a single week than a decade of careful management had managed on its own. The following August, in 2023, the remnants of Hurricane Hilary swept through the desert and dropped rain on a landscape that measures its yearly precipitation in single digits. Flooding is rarely good news for a fish this specialized, and biologists watched anxiously as runoff poured toward Devil's Hole. This time, though, the storm mostly helped, washing a fine layer of nutrient-rich clay and silt into the pool and feeding the same algae the earthquake had once stripped away. Through it all, rain or drought, calm water or waves, the count went on exactly as it always had. Biologists on scaffolding above the surface with clipboards, Other biologists in scuba gear below with waterproof slates, tallying every fish they could see across the shelf and down into the shadows, one at a time, by eye. Less than 2 years after that first quake, in the spring of 2024, the count climbed even higher, to 191, the best spring result in 25 years. For the first time since the record low of 2013, it looked like the population might genuinely be recovering, not through any breakthrough in a laboratory, but through 11 years of patient counting, careful egg collection, and a species that, given even the smallest opening, kept trying to come back on its own. Just months later, the mood among the biologists who tracked this fish had been about as good as it had ever been. The population had spent more than a decade pulling itself back from the record low of 2013. There was real, cautious optimism that Devil's Hole might finally be pulling itself out of the hole, so to speak, for good. It would not last. In December of 2024, and then again in February of 2025, 2 more distant earthquakes sent their tremors through the aquifer beneath Devil's Hole. This time, the timing made all the difference. The 2022 earthquake had struck in September, deep into the desert's long, sunny season, when algae stripped from the shelf could regrow within a matter of weeks. These 2 hit in winter, during the exact months when the angle of the sun barely reaches the water at all. The shelf was scoured clean again, just like before, except this time there was no sunlight left over to regrow what the water had swept away. The count that spring told the story in a single number, 38 fish, down from 191 the year before. It kept falling from there. By the next count, biologists were finding barely 20 fish on the shelf, fewer than at any point since the historic low of 2013, and this time there was no accidental earthquake-triggered spawning wave waiting on the horizon to save it. For more than 50 years, the standard response to a crash in Devil's Hole had been to watch, to count, and to wait for the population to find its own way back. The same patient, hands-off approach that had defined the species management since the very first scuba count in 1972. This time, biologists did something that had never once been done in the history of the program. They opened the refuge tank 4 miles away and pulled 19 captive-raised, Devil's Hole-descended fish out of water their species had never physically touched. They carried them out to the real Devil's Hole, and they released them, deliberately, directly into the wild population, betting that fish raised for over a decade in a replica pool could still find their place on the exact shelf their ancestors' eggs had come from. It was not a decision made lightly. Pulling fish out of a secure, working captive population and gambling them on a wild pool that had just hit a near-record low meant risking the one safety net the species had left, if it failed. The 19 fish selected were slowly acclimated to match the wild pool's exact temperature and chemistry before ever leaving the tank, then carried the short distance to Devil's Hole and eased into the water by hand, one at a time. It worked. By the spring 2026 count, biologists found 77 fish back in Devil's Hole, nearly 4 times the number from the low point less than a year earlier, with several hundred more still held safely in the refuge tank as backup. For the first time in the program's history, a captive population had been used not just as insurance sitting in reserve, but as an active tool to physically rebuild the wild one. Kevin Wilson, the aquatic ecologist who has managed the Devil's Hole program for the National Park Service for years, called it a calculated risk that paid off, the product of a strategic plan drawn up long before anyone knew it would be needed. The Devil's Hole pupfish has become something bigger than just one endangered fish story along the way. Because it has survived for decades at population sizes that would doom almost any other vertebrate to a genetic death spiral, it has turned into one of the most closely studied examples anywhere in conservation biology of how small a population can get, and still, somehow, hang on. In a field where most models predict eventual collapse once numbers drop this low, this fish has spent decades quietly rewriting the odds. Lessons from monitoring it, from the egg collection protocols to the captive release strategy used in 2025, are increasingly being borrowed by biologists working to save other critically endangered species, clinging to similarly tiny numbers, in habitats far outside the Nevada desert. 77 is real progress. It is also nowhere near safe. That number is still less than half of what biologists routinely counted before the 1990s decline ever began. And a species that has spent more than a decade bouncing between population sizes in the dozens and the low hundreds carries the genetic scars of that bottleneck, whether the count is climbing or not. A gene pool that small has less room to adapt to whatever comes next, and the underlying pressure that started all of this, back in 1968, has never actually gone away. The Amargosa Desert and the wider region around Las Vegas continue to grow, continue to draw more water out of the ground every single year, from the same connected aquifer system a Supreme Court ruling once tried to protect. 50 years after Caperate versus United States, the water beneath Devil's Hole is, in a real sense, still being fought over. It is simply being fought over more quietly now. There is also a piece of this story that no legal ruling and no replica tank can fully insure against. The shelf this entire species depends on sits at the mercy of earthquakes that can strike thousands of miles away, without warning, on a schedule nobody can predict and nobody can prevent. The 2022 quake happened to hit at the right time of year to help. The 2024 and 2025 quakes happened to hit at the worst possible time of year to hurt. Nothing currently guarantees which kind comes next. Today, more than 50 years after the first scuba count went into that water back in April of 1972, a biologist still climbs down a metal scaffold twice a year, once in spring and once in fall, and lowers into that same 93-degree pool to count whatever is left. The diving equipment has changed a great deal over the decades. The people doing the actual counting have changed several times over as well. The count itself has not stopped, not once, not through a Supreme Court case, not through a record low of 35 fish, not through 2 more crashes in the years since. Somewhere below the surface, on a shelf of algae-covered rock, the exact size of a small bedroom, a fish species that has existed nowhere else on Earth for close to 20,000 years is still spawning, still feeding, still being counted, one careful dive at a time. Kevin Wilson has been diving into Devil's Hole for the National Park Service for the better part of 2 decades now, long enough to have counted the crash of 2013, the record highs of 2022 and 2024, and the crash that followed less than a year later. On any given count day, there is usually someone on that scaffolding who was not even born when the very first dive went into the water back in 1972, learning the same protocol, using the same hand signals, adding their tally to a dataset that by now spans more than half a century without a single missed count. This was never a story about a species that got saved once, by a court ruling or a tank of replica water, and then got to rest. It is a story about a species being kept alive in real time right now by people who keep showing up twice a year to do the same careful, unglamorous count their predecessors started more than half a century ago. Because the alternative to counting is not knowing, and for a fish with exactly one home on the entire planet, not knowing is the same thing as losing it. There is no substitute fix waiting in some lab, no other pool to move them to if this one ever truly fails. There is only the counting, the careful egg collection, and, when the moment calls for it, a calculated gamble like the one made in 2025. 35 fish, once. 77 fish, now. Whatever the next count says, somebody will already be in the water to see it. That has been true every single season since April of 1972, and there is no real indication it is about to stop being true now. If a number that small managed to hold your attention this long, all the way to the very end, that is exactly the point of telling the story this way. Subscribe, and come back for whatever the next count turns out to be.